This session is going to be a little bit different to most Friday lunchtime sessions, in that this is a kind of genuine lecture. And so it will be mostly me speaking, but you are very welcome to ask questions. You're very welcome to put comments or questions in the chat. But I don't have any plans to send you to breakout rooms for group work, unless you get particularly excited. Okay, so the focus of the lecture is academic integrity. And a question for you, first of all, there are photos, or there are images of 6 people on the screen right now. Do you know any of them? You can either tell me or write in the chat if you recognize any of these people. I'd be really surprised if you don't know any of them. Hello, Samson. Okay, Miriam says she recognizes some of them. So what, familiar faces, but possibly not people whose names you know. Okay, so these people then, they all have, well, 5 of them have something in common. One of them is the odd one out. And I'll tell you, we've got, top left is Martin Luther King. The lady is Virginia Woolf, an English writer. The guy with the guitar is George Harrison from the Beatles. Bottom right is William Shakespeare. Bottom middle is a German politician called Theodor zu Guttenberg. And bottom left, it's Charles Dickens. Does anyone want to guess what they might have in common? What connects these 6 people? Yes, they are all, yeah, they are right. All connected in some way to writing. Oladmeji?
Yeah, they are writer.
Okay.
Motivational speakers.
Motivational speakers, maybe. I don't know how motivational William Shakespeare would have been if he gave talks. Actually, okay. Their connection is plagiarism. 5 of these people have been or were accused of plagiarism in different ways. The odd one out is the woman. Virginia Woolf was kind of the possible victim of plagiarism. So another author was accused of plagiarizing Virginia Woolf's work. But yeah, there is some evidence of plagiarism in Martin Luther King's PhD doctoral thesis. Theodor zu Guttenberg is a German politician who developed a really successful career in politics and was a finance minister in Germany 10 years ago, when it was revealed, or it was discovered, that he had plagiarized in his own PhD thesis, and he had his degree taken away from him by his university, and he resigned, and kind of his career looked to be dead at that point. So he suffered as a result of being found guilty of plagiarism. William Shakespeare is thought to have, the works of William Shakespeare, it's not always clear who wrote every play, and he definitely used the stories of other writers, and it's quite possible he used the words of other writers in his plays. George Harrison was taken to court for copying the melody of one of his songs. So maybe George Harrison's Miriam, you're asking about how Theodor zu Guttenberg wasn't wasn't caught until later. I think that's a story for another day. I think the message to take away is that if you cheat at university and get away with it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got away with it forever. Yeah, because I think, Miriam, what happens is that when you complete a PhD thesis, and in fact when you complete a master's thesis, your work becomes available to the public. I mean, you can find anyone's PhD thesis and read it. When someone becomes famous later in life, it's more likely that someone will then look at their PhD thesis. There'll be lots of people who write a PhD thesis. It becomes publicly available, but not many people go and look for it. If you're famous, it's more likely that someone will look at your work, and if you have cheated in that work, it's more likely that then someone will find out. George Harrison was the guitarist in the Beatles. One of the most famous songs he wrote is a song called My Sweet Lord, which has a very similar melody to an older song, a lovely soul song called She's So Fine by the Chiffons. And he was taken to court and successfully sued for copying the melody. So we've got people here who borrowed or stole other people's words. There are other people who, like George Harrison, who borrowed or stole other people's music. And Charles Dickens is an incredible case because Charles Dickens kind of managed to plagiarize himself, because he kept selling the rights to publish his work to different people. So he was making lots of money, but he was breaking all sorts of laws. But these are all examples of kind of famous people who were in some way involved in plagiarism cases. Plagiarism is the main focus of this session. But perhaps plagiarism is lots of different things. So I'm going to show you some sentences, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree. Feel free to use your microphone to say yes or no, or to write into the chat. So how about this? Plagiarism is dishonest. We'll come to clearer definitions later, but plagiarism is dishonest. Yes or no?
Yes.
No, because it should be dishonesty, not dishonest, as in like plagiarism itself.
Oh, I mean, grammatically, we could have an adjective or a noun there. But no, plagiarism might be considered a form of dishonesty, yes. Let's see, because it is possible to accidentally plagiarize. Plagiarism is like stealing. I think this is
Yes.
one way that people look at plagiarism. It's like, and I think I've already used those words. It's like stealing somebody else's words or ideas and pretending that they're your own. Plagiarism is an academic offence. Yes, it is. So
Yes.
it's particularly serious at universities. Plagiarism is nothing for you guys to worry about.
No.
I'd like to think that it isn't something for you to worry about, because actually, if you do things correctly, you'll never plagiarize. But that's something we'll cover in future weeks. Plagiarism is definitely really difficult to spell or pronounce. I've lost count of the number of students I've met who pronounce this in different ways. Plagiarismo, for example. Do you think plagiarism is unfair on international students?
No.
I'm going to talk about this a little bit more over the next hour, because we do often find that international students are more likely to be punished for plagiarism than home students, which might be because they're more likely to plagiarize, or maybe they're more likely to be caught. But I've met the idea before from international students who think that plagiarism is kind of unfair on them because they come from different educational cultures where perhaps it's not a problem. But I'll try to explore that a little bit today. I've had students tell me before that plagiarism is anti-Islamic, and I'll try to address this too. I won't ask you what you think just yet. I'd like to argue that plagiarism is a complex and interesting issue, and that it's not a boring subject for a lecturer. But if you do think that plagiarism is a boring subject for a lecture, and you're here with me now live, I hope I can persuade you that it's not in the next 40 or 50 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to start maybe asking the question whether plagiarism is something that we should be scared of, whether there are reasons to be fearful. And I'm going to talk about the historical context of plagiarism. Now, I just used the term reason to be fearful, and I've done that for several reasons. It's a kind of play on words. There's quite a famous song from the late 1970s by a guy called Ian Dury called "Reasons to be Cheerful," and that's such a kind of now common word in common expression in English that we can find people writing books and calling them reasons to be cheerful. And I've even got this book by an academic called Jude Carroll, and it's about plagiarism. And she has called one of the sections of her book "Reasons to be Cheerful." So I think something interesting is happening here, because we often play with words and we often use other people's words to make like clever references or to be catchy. But when we're doing something like that, it's not really, if it's not really plagiarism, is it? And if I take the phrase "reasons to be cheerful" and I kind of turn it into "reasons to be fearful," and I don't tell you that I'm kind of quoting someone else, I don't think I'm plagiarizing. But let's see maybe why that might be the case. It's a complex issue. And the idea that it's particularly complex for international students, or it's particularly complex if English is not your first language, or you've been educated in a culture where English isn't the first language, and now you are in a different context like higher education in the UK. I've got this example from a guy called Alistair Pennycook, who back in the, I think, late 1980s, early 1990s, was teaching English in China. And he set his students a piece of homework, and he asked them all to write about a famous person. All they had to do was find out something about a famous person and write about their life. And he expected the students to write about famous people that they liked and admired. When he received the homework from his students, a lot of it was quite badly written. The students didn't have a great level of English, but they'd still engage with the task and they'd try to write about a famous person they liked. And then one student gave him this piece of work. So one student from who couldn't speak English very well, was probably not interested in Abraham Lincoln, the former president of the United States, but wrote this paragraph. Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Kentucky to Thomas and Nancy Lincoln. And immediately when Alistair Pennycook read that sentence, he thought, that's not her work. She didn't write that. And he continued on and thought, well, he got really angry with his student because he thought, she's cheated. I've asked her to find out about a famous person and to write about them at homework, and she has just copied something from, I don't know, maybe he thought maybe it's from an encyclopedia, it's from a book somewhere, but it's definitely not. He knew immediately it wasn't the student's own words. So he invited the student to come and speak to him, and he was really angry. He said, oh, you've kind of cheated on your homework. And the student was really surprised. The student was shocked and upset. She didn't think she had done anything wrong at all. And this student had once, in an English class with a Chinese teacher, had been given this paragraph to learn. So this paragraph about Abraham Lincoln, all of the kids in the same class had been given the paragraph. They had learnt it, they'd memorized it, and the student was able to say to Alistair Pennycook, look, I didn't just copy this, I know it, they're my words. And she was able to repeat everything back to him as she had written. And then he suddenly realized, oh, this is a strange situation, because I think what she's done is plagiarized. I think she's taken somebody else's words, presented them as her own, and wants to get some kind of credit for it. But actually, as far as the student was concerned, all she had done was learn something by heart, and she was just showing quite proudly that she had been able to learn something by heart, and she'd been able to produce perfect English with no mistakes as a result. But it is plagiarism, but it's complicated. And the first sentence I showed you earlier is like, plagiarism is dishonesty. Now, this girl who wrote this paragraph did not think she was being dishonest when she did it. Okay, so I'm going to kind of head back in time and think about like the historical context for this. Back in the late 1970s, this French philosopher Michel Foucault wrote maybe an important and influential piece of work where he asked the question, what is an author? And I think that asking that question in the late 20th century was a little bit different, as he showed, to asking that question in an earlier time. So if I ask you, everyone in this room, you can shout out or you can type in, who's the most famous author from your country? Let me know. If you type your answer in the chat, I'll read it out. But if you want to say, you're welcome to say. Who is the most famous author from your country?
Yeah, I'm from Nigeria, Wole Soyinka.
Oh, lovely. So someone has written the same name as in the chat. I don't know if that was you too, Samson. And we've got Ravindranath Tagore. Mahesh, how is my pronunciation? Probably quite bad. Okay. Any other names you want to share? Uncle Ebo White. Thank you, Sandra. Why uncle?
Because we all call him uncle. That's
okay. So it's like a sign of respect for a kind of
elderly
an important
person.
senior cultural figure. Lovely.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Now, notice that when I asked that question, I don't think it was very difficult for you to answer. You didn't ask me, oh, what is an... If I ask you who's the most famous author from your country, you give me an answer. You didn't stop and say, what's an author? If I ask you, who do you think is the most successful author in the English language? Any suggestions who the most successful author in the English language might be?
Yeah, is it in our country?
In all across the world.
Yeah.
Just in the English language.
Yeah, still the same as Wole Soyinka.
No, I mean not necessarily from your country, but the most successful author ever to have written in the English language. Mahesh says Shakespeare. Again, though, this is a question that we feel that we can answer. And actually, this is a good sign for us as a university community thinking about who is an author and who isn't an author. We have a clear sense that of who authors are. Thank you, Miriam, for Ibn Battuta. Okay. Now, I deliberately used the word successful there, not most famous, because I don't really know how we judge the most famous. Maybe Shakespeare's pretty famous. J.K. Rowling is certainly successful. And if we measure authors by how many books they've sold, then yeah, the best-selling individual book in history in the English language, or rather, by a specific author, is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, because that's sold around 200 million copies. Nobody said J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, but J.K. Rowling is, despite being relatively recent, the third best-selling author in the English language. The reason Shakespeare isn't here is because, actually, well, we'll see. Historically, Shakespeare was writing plays at a time when they were performed, so wasn't writing novels in order for them to be sold. So there's no individual book that's sold more than 100 million copies by William Shakespeare. But there you go. We've got a Chinese author here in kind of book sales in translation, and we've got a French author as well whose book has been translated into English and sold over 100 million copies. But yeah, there's a group of maybe the most successful authors in terms of sales. Now, there are some important books missing from this list, though. There are some books that have sold more than 200 million copies. Can you think of a book that has probably sold more than 200 million copies? There are, I think, two very famous books. Well, I'll be happy to answer that question myself. But yeah, the book that has historically sold more copies than any other book is actually the Bible. So I think the Quran has certainly sold, I think, maybe almost a billion copies, but there are kind of multiple billions of copies of the Bible have been sold in history. And an important point I want to make is, okay, if the best-selling book in the English language around the world in history is the Bible, and it's missing from this list, well, who's the author of the Bible? Now, I'm just talking about like the history of plagiarism and authorship here. So I'm not talking in anywhere about my beliefs or faith, but the image here is a representation of a scene from the Bible where Moses has come back to his people, having had a conversation with God, and God has dictated to him the 10 commandments, which you may be aware of. 10 commandments, like don't steal, don't kill, 10 things that you shouldn't do. And there's a Bible story which involves Moses speaking to God, receiving the word of God, which he chips into a piece of stone, and then he comes down from the mountain back to his people. And actually, in the episode, he does it in the Bible. He does it twice, because the first time he does it, when he returns to his people, they're all breaking the 10 commandments, and he gets so angry that he breaks the stone in half and has to go back and do it again. But for Christians, the Bible is the word of God. And so what do we do if one of our authors is God? And this brings me onto a kind of historical perspective that I really hope will help us make sense of what is and what isn't plagiarism, and why we can kind of copy some things in some situations and it seems to be fine, and we can't copy in others and it isn't fine. So I'm taking this idea from a guy called Kearney, who wrote a book in the 1980s called The Wake of Imagination, and he tries to divide history into 3 periods, which he calls pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. And and Foucault talks about this kind of thing as well, that most of our ideas about authorship, about what is an author, and therefore what is plagiarism and what isn't plagiarism, come from the what Kearney calls the modern imagination. And the modern imagination is heavily influenced by technology and ideas that probably came from the technology indirectly. And my main image on this slide is an image of the printing press. So the development of the printing press in the modern era made it possible for people to print and sell books, and for everyone to read different copies of a book. I've got an image on this slide also of René Descartes, who in the modern era, his philosophy put man at the center of the universe. Now, in the pre-modern era, man is not really the center of the universe. God is the center of the universe. And in the pre-modern era, we as humans would tell stories and retell stories by copying. So I've got two images here. One is a religious text, which in the pre-modern era, a limited number of people could read and write. Most education took place within religious institutions, and the purpose of writing would often be to copy out religious texts, and people would spread religious messages by going and learning them and standing in front of big groups of people and repeating them. Right, so it's about kind of copying. And even in kind of art and literature, the picture on the bottom left is an actor called Sean Bean, who's playing the hero Odysseus from Greek mythology. And the story of Odysseus is told in two different poems by a poet called Homer. But the way that this story, these poems were spread around the world to audiences was not through printing, but through people learning and repeating the poems, right? Just like our Chinese student who learned a text about Abraham Lincoln and then repeated it. Actually, the typical form of communicating texts and sharing texts in the pre-modern era is simply to copy them, and for individual people to have a role as someone who copies somebody else's story. So when I talk about pre-modern era, I'm talking about biblical times, classical times, so like the times of classical Greek and Roman literature, up through kind of medieval times. And what the features of this era is, religious texts are very important, and religious texts are believed to come directly from God. There's a tradition of oral text, so people don't read, but they tell each other stories and repeat. And the pre-modern imagination, therefore, is mimetic. Now, mimetic is about copying. What we do is copy one another. We try to say exactly what somebody else has said and then repeat it. And that is the whole point in the pre-modern era of text and retelling texts. So the emphasis is on reproduction of texts, not production of text. People who tell stories are not creating new stories, they're just retelling somebody else's stories. And we can even see that, like, if you study Roman literature, you'll find that Roman literature is just another version of Greek literature. They changed the names, but the stories stay the same. Now, so an example of that is in Greek literature, this character Odysseus, we can find him in Latin literature of slightly later, and he goes by the name Ulysses. Okay. We go forward to the modern era, okay, and now we can see a difference in the way that people tell stories and the modern imagination. So there's a shift from mimetic to productive. So in the modern era, we're no longer just repeating what we've heard, but there's an emphasis on producing new things. And in the 15th century, the printing press is invented, and then that makes it possible to take the work of an individual author, print it, say, put the author's name on the front, and then we can then we can sell it around the country, and as technology and transport improves, we can start to sell these texts around the world. So by the 19th century, Charles Dickens is selling books not only in England, but also all across America, even before he has visited America. So it's in this period, around the 17th and 18th century, that we get our modern ideas of authorship. And that's why when I say, tell me a famous author from your country, you can answer that question. If we go back in time 1,000 years and I ask you the same question, I don't think you can answer it. Now, this is the period of the Enlightenment in Europe, where I think I've already said, where the human becomes the center of not just of the universe, but of creativity. Before the modern era, we think about like God as the creator, and the kind of the ideas and philosophies of the modern era start to think of people as creators, and that kind of comes from about the 17th century with Descartes' discourse on method. And it's no surprise that as early as like 1710, in this country, we start to have ideas about copyright and intellectual property and who owns these words, what rights do this author have. And that's where you can, as you can imagine, that's where ideas about plagiarism come from. Because in the modern era, an author becomes the owner of their own words in a way that they hadn't been before. I'll try to illustrate this with two images. This is one of the most famous images in the world. Now, mimetic or the pre-modern imagination, a mimetic format involves just taking an image and reproducing it. When we get to the modern era, we really, really care about the origins of images and words, and we like it in the pre-modern era. If we hear a story from one person or another, it kind of doesn't matter as long as it's the same story. By the modern era, we really care about what's the original story, who's the original author of this, what's the I'm much more interested in seeing the original painting of La Honda here than a copy of it. But in the 20th century, and I think this is why our worlds and our minds are a little bit more complicated, because in the 20th century, something changed again. And we start to see, you might have seen images like this. The image of the Mona Lisa, La Honda, La Gioconda, is so famous that people start to play with it. And you could look at a Lego picture of this famous work of art, and you immediately recognize what it's supposed to be. But you also know that it's kind of a joke if someone has made it out of Lego. And likewise, you can see people playing with the image, putting it into different artistic styles. This is what we call postmodern, or the postmodern imagination. And in the postmodern era, and we are very much living in the postmodern era, in our wider culture, we've moved from the productive to what we call the parodic. So parodic, being parodic or parody, is about being playful with words and with images. Okay, so technology in the modern era led to the idea of authorship. But technology in the postmodern era blurs the idea of authorship. Last week, in last Friday's class, I showed some pictures of Albert Einstein alongside some words that he never said. And if we're on social media, we'll see that kind of thing all the time. We'll see a quote and a picture of Einstein, or a quote and a picture of, I don't know, maybe Abraham Lincoln. And actually, we've completely confused where these words originally come from, because we use them in different ways. And anyone now can be an author. You can write something and put it on social media and 1 million people can read it. You can write to a blog, you can publish your own work, you can write to a newspaper and get your ideas published. So in the postmodern era, anyone could be an author, and it's very hard to tell sometimes where words originate. As early as like 1968, a French philosopher called Roland Barthes kind of was noticing this development and declared the death of the author. He said back then that texts were actually all, he was kind of arguing that you couldn't say anything original anymore, that everything came from somewhere. There was everything would be a tissue of quotations. Alistair Pennycook, the teacher with the Chinese student, tries to summarize all this by saying, we're no longer speaking subjects, but spoken subjects. We don't create language, but language creates us. Here's some kind of postmodern images. Does anyone know who this lady is? So I really love this photograph. This is a photograph of someone quite famous from the 1950s and 1960s, someone who died in the 1960s. And her name is Marilyn Monroe. Do you know Marilyn Monroe? Have you heard that name before?
No.
Okay, so in the 50s and 60s, Marilyn Monroe was considered maybe their most kind of glamorous, one of the most glamorous, beautiful women in the world. She was a movie star, and she was really, she had a very kind of interesting and complicated life. She married multiple times. She married America's most famous baseball player in one marriage, and in another marriage married one of America's kind of greatest writers at the time. So she married a sportsman, she married an intellectual, and so you know there's an interesting aura around Marilyn Monroe, and something, because she was a kind of sex symbol and kind of judged for her kind of physical her physical attractiveness. There's something really interesting about this picture because, okay, she's in a swimming costume. She's showing quite a lot of her skin for the time, but she's also reading a book, which is notoriously one of the most difficult books you could ever read, and it's called Ulysses by James Joyce. So she's reading a very clever book in this picture, but she's right at the end of the book, which either means she's finished the book or she's jumped to a famous section at the end of the book, which is actually quite a sexual and explicit part of the book. So the image is saying lots and lots of different things to us. It's supposed to say lots of different things to us. And that's an example of kind of like our postmodern condition, because we've got representations of lots of different elements of culture from the United States and from the English-speaking world. So the book she's reading is by an Irish author called James Joyce. Now, just to complicate things further, the book is by James Joyce. James Joyce wrote a book called A Portrait of the Artist of as a Young Man. So he wrote a book kind of about being an author, and the main character in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is a guy called Stephen Dedalus, who is a representation of James Joyce, the author. So he wrote a book about being a young author. He then later took the myth of Odysseus, or Ulysses, that we kind of referred to earlier from Greek literature, and he put that story, he set the story in 20th century Dublin. He changed the hero from this warrior to a kind of quite awkward, clumsy, not particularly heroic or attractive Jewish guy called Leopold Bloom. but he took the 24 books of the Odyssey, which is the story of Odysseus, and he broke it down into 24 chapters, where each chapter represented an hour in a day. And so he took a Greek epic poem and turned it into the story of one day in Dublin. That's the book that Marilyn Monroe is reading. And another book that does the same thing is called Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, all set in one day. And I mentioned at the beginning that Virginia Woolf was considered the victim of plagiarism because some people say that James Joyce stole the idea from Virginia Woolf. And that is the postmodern condition. But something happens in the postmodern imagination, which allows us to really play with words and phrases and images from other cultures, from other times, in a way that we hadn't seen before. Famous poem called The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot has a line in it, "Those are the pearls that were his eyes," which is a direct quotation from William Shakespeare. He doesn't present it as a quotation. It's just there. It's one of the lines in his poem. And yet, in the postmodern imagination, we don't consider this to be stealing. We don't consider this to be plagiarism. We consider it to be art, because he's kind of playing with the words of another author and putting them into a new context and making us think about them differently. And yet, if we look at a definition of plagiarism, the basic definition of plagiarism is the practice of taking someone else's work or ideas and passing them off as one's own. So perhaps with an example like this one of a poet using a line from Shakespeare, it's not plagiarism because the author and the reader are both supposed to know that the words come from somewhere else. Okay? Very tricky. Now, I'll tell you something about where the word plagiarism comes from. It actually comes from we started by saying plagiarism is stealing, plagiarism is dishonest. And the origin of the word plagiarism is from Latin, meaning kidnapping. So it's literally, for speakers of English, people in this tradition, plagiarism is about it's like stealing someone's children. If our words are our children, then plagiarism is the theft of the children. And unsurprisingly, as we've seen, the term plagiarism was first used in English in the modern era, after the development of the printing press, but before the development of copyright laws. And it first appeared as an adjective, plagiary. And then we start to see plagiary as a noun, and then plagiarism with different spelling comes around about 20 years later. And there's a nice tool on Google called the Ngram viewer, and you can type in a word and look at the history of a word over hundreds of years. You can see that back in the 1600s, we used the word plagiary a lot, but we no longer really use it. The word plagiarist was kind of not used a great deal until the early 19th century. But the word plagiarize as a verb has grown in use dramatically since around 1997, a date that we'll come back to soon. And the idea of plagiarism is something that we're concerned with. Look, we were first concerned about plagiarism when we first had copyright laws, but in recent years, plagiarism has become an increasingly large concern. And one of the reasons is because of its importance in higher education and the impact that can have elsewhere. So we'll often find in British newspapers dramatic stories about increases in the amount of cheating at university. So here's one, it's 10 years old now, but yeah, a journalist got hold of some data on the number of academic offence cases at universities and thought it would be shocking to say 45,000 students at 80 different institutions had been found guilty of cheating in different ways. And obviously there has been a growth in the number of academic misconduct cases in UK universities. And there's been an increase actually since kind of the first lockdown and COVID times, but I'm not sure that it's only a kind of a 21st century problem. There's a very good argument that you could make that from around 1997, 1998, that was when in the UK we all started to have like the internet in our homes. And it's also around the same time where it became normal for university students to submit their work electronically rather than, or certainly printed, rather than when I was an undergraduate student, I studied from 1993 to 1996 was my first degree. Most of the essays I wrote by hand. And yeah, there was no need for us to type our essays. We didn't have email at university until 1997, and there was no such thing as Canvas or Turnitin. So one thing that we can say is that internet technology made it easier to plagiarize and easier to start an essay just by finding a text somewhere and copying it and pasting it into a blank document. So Ian Jack here in this article is saying after 1998, students didn't need to begin essays with a blank screen. You could start by finding a text somewhere else and copying and pasting. And that's certainly true, but it's also true that it's the development of technology that allows us to identify plagiarism and cheating, not just that it allows it to happen. Right, there's a tradition in the United States. This is an example of a frat house at a US college. And a long time before the internet, it was perfectly normal for fraternity and sorority houses in US colleges to keep like banks of essays. Like every year, students would keep their essays so that future students, when they had to write the same essays, could just copy them and submit. And yeah, when I was a student in 1993, 94, I saw other students copying work directly from books and from other students. They were doing it by hand, so there was less chance that the academic marking their work would recognize where it had come from. Now, in universities, we need kind of very clear definitions of plagiarism. And I spoke earlier about like the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern. Now, postmodern confuses things because it's our regular 21st century culture. But ultimately, the idea of plagiarism in UK universities is very much related to the idea of the modern imagination and the modern ideas of authorship. Okay, so we can't be too creative. We think about authors and production, and the pre-modern idea of just like copying and repeating is itself a problem. So in UK higher education, think of like the modern mentality when we think about what plagiarism is. Plagiarism, basically, this is from Bailey 2011, taking ideas or words from a source without giving credit to the author, in other words, without referencing it. It is seen as a kind of theft. It is considered to be an academic crime. In academic work, ideas and words are seen as private property belonging to the person who first thought or wrote them. A much shorter definition, plagiarism is best defined as a deliberate activity as the conscious copying from the work of others, conscious copying. I have to say though, I've seen plenty of students who claim that they have plagiarized accidentally, like they copied and pasted something from somewhere else, then they forgot to add quotation marks, or they forgot to add a reference. They forgot to go back and change it into their own words, and would claim that it wasn't deliberate. However, academic offences tend to be treated as if all students will know and understand what plagiarism is, and that if they've done something accidentally, then that's their fault, and it will still be treated as if they've done it deliberately. There's a nice small book, it costs about £5, written by Kate Williams and Jude Carroll, and it's called Referencing and Understanding Plagiarism. We often see those things together. And they give this metaphor that I think is quite nice. I know in some weeks I ask you what you think about English food and whether you think English food is terrible. But their metaphor is this: here's a piece of English food here, a pie, and they suggest that like good academic writing, good academic practice involves like going to the supermarket, choosing ingredients. So that's like going to the library, choosing what you read, choosing the ingredients, working with the ingredients so that you might kind of like chop them up, peel them, clean them, working with the ingredients and putting the ingredients together yourself in order to make a pie. So you can then serve your friends and say, I've made you this pie. Come round to my house, I've made this pie. That would be good academic practice. That's the equivalent of going to the library, doing the reading, taking notes on your reading, and turning your notes on your reading into an essay that you've written yourself. No one is expecting you to grow your own carrots or produce your own meat. They're not even expecting you to make your own pastry in this example. Plagiarism, however, would be you go to Tesco, you buy a ready-made pie, you serve it to your friends, and you tell your friends you made the pie yourself. That in that process, you didn't do any work, basically, and in this process, you did do work. So I quite like that metaphor. I've got some examples here, and you can type into the chat whether you think these things are plagiarism or not, are examples of plagiarism or not. Copying a paragraph but changing a few words and giving a citation. Is that plagiarism?
No, it's not plagiarism.
I'd say if you're just changing a few words, it's plagiarism. This is not your paragraph.
But
Cutting and pasting a short article from a website with no citation.
plagiarism.
Yes, yeah. Taking 2 paragraphs from a classmate's essay without citation.
Plagiarism.
Plagiarism. Yeah, it's technically called collusion. And if you copy from your friend will be in trouble too. So I'm sure if you guys are in this session, you're good students. If a friend asks to see your work, just be careful. Taking a graph from a textbook and giving the source, like using an image from a textbook and saying where it comes from.
It's not plagiarism.
Yeah, it's not plagiarism.
Yeah.
Taking a quotation, giving a citation, but not using quotation marks.
Plagiarism.
It
Plagiarism.
is, yeah, because you're
Yeah.
presenting the words as if they're your own.
Yep.
Using something that you think of as general knowledge, and then no reference there. It's something you think of as general knowledge. For example, you say large areas of rainforest have been cut down in recent years. Is that plagiarism?
Without citation.
Yeah, because it's general knowledge.
It is plagiarism if without citation.
Well, actually, this isn't plagiarism because if like large areas of rainforest have been cut down in recent years. Remember what I was saying earlier about like what an author is, and the author being the origin of words or ideas. Who's the first person? Who is the person who told us that large areas of rainforest have been cut down in recent years? I think it's very difficult to to pin this to a particular author or source of information. So if it is kind of generally accepted knowledge, it's fine. I'll say something more about that in a moment. But obviously, if your essay is all based on general knowledge, then an overall essay is not going to be very good. And if you write a sentence like large areas of rainforest have been cut down in recent years, I'd like more specificity. Like, what is a large area? How much? Where is the rainforest? What do we mean by recent years? So if we're writing too generally, it's probably not going to be very good. But actually writing stuff that's general knowledge doesn't need to be referenced, and it isn't plagiarism, because to plagiarize you have to be taking somebody else's words or ideas. I'm not sure that we're doing that here. How about using a paragraph from an essay you wrote, maybe that had been marked in a previous semester?
Plagiarism.
Yeah, you can self-plagiarize. You're not allowed to take credit twice for one piece of work. Using the results of your own research without a citation.
Plagiarism. Plagiarism.
Well, it's a tricky one, this, because when you do a dissertation, for example, as a master's student, if you're collecting data, when you write up your data, you will write a summary of it, an analysis of it. You'll maybe provide some tables. You'll also provide the raw data in your appendix of your paper. So actually, if you've retrieved the data yourself and you're telling the reader where it comes from, then that's not plagiarism. That's your contribution. How about discussing an essay topic with a group of classmates and using some of their ideas in your own work?
Plagiarism.
You know what? I'm not so sure.
It's not plagiarism. It's not plagiarism. It's not plagiarism.
It's tricky.
It's not plagiarism.
Because whatever their ideas are, they probably won't be whatever their ideas are. I would recommend that you do some reading and see if you find those ideas somewhere else and reference that. But if a friend has an idea about a good way to structure an essay, I think that's fine. If a friend is giving you a paragraph and you're repeating that, then that's not fine. But you know, it's tricky. Number 9 to me sounds like some group work and being supportive, not collusion like number 3. How about giving a citation for some information but misspelling the author's name? Is that plagiarism? I think the answer is that it depends on how bad the spelling was. So it's kind of poor writing practice, but not necessarily. It's not necessarily plagiarism, unless the name is completely unrecognizable. Very quickly, I spoke before about general knowledge, and that seemed to get a mixed response from you. Does anyone know who this person is? No. Interesting, right? Interesting. Because I once looked for a definition of common knowledge, and it struck me that our ideas of common knowledge are very kind of are quite culturally biased, maybe. So I'm always surprised when people don't know who this is, because he seems like a very famous person in this country, maybe an important part of my life or the lives of people around my age. But this is John Lennon. Right? Now, when I was a child, when I was about 8 years old, so it was about 1981, John Lennon was murdered. Okay? And when I looked, I was looking into how we define common knowledge. And an example I found, which I kind of agree with, is that it is common knowledge that John Lennon was, I should know this, was killed on, I think, the 9th of December, 8th or 9th of December, 1981. So look, I'm not even getting the dates right, and I'm saying it's common knowledge. And that he was killed by a guy called Mark Chapman. Okay, that is all considered common knowledge. But what is not common knowledge is why Mark Chapman killed John Lennon. Okay, so I think that's quite, to me, that works as an example of the difference between common knowledge and not common knowledge. So if you write in an essay, John Lennon was murdered by Mark Chapman, that's common knowledge. It's, you know, Mark Chapman was found guilty of this. It was, he didn't deny it. But what we don't know is why he killed him. And different experts might have different interpretations or reasons. In the same way, we can say the Second World War started in 1939 and ended in 1945. That's common knowledge. But what isn't common knowledge is what were the causes of the beginning of World War II, and what was the moment where the ending of World War II was inevitable, say. So questions of why and how are often not common knowledge, but dates when things happen, names of people are typically considered common knowledge. And yet, I showed you this photo and you didn't know who it was. So your common knowledge is not necessarily the same as my common knowledge. And maybe that's one area where it is hard for international students to get a sense, to come to the UK, come to UK universities and get a sense of the things that we think are common knowledge and the things that we don't think are common knowledge. However, I think a positive message for you is every field has its own common knowledge. And by reading and attending lectures and joining in seminar discussions, you will develop your own sense of what is considered common knowledge and what isn't considered common knowledge. And if you are not explaining why you know, how you know something, then that's where you probably need to start providing references for information. But that's something that we'll look at in one of the remaining Friday afternoon sessions too. I'm going to head quickly towards the end of this lecture. I'm going to leave these sentences on the screen now. I won't go through them, but yeah, we see lots of different excuses or reasons given by students for plagiarism. Like they might have been found guilty of plagiarism. We found that their work was the same as somebody else's. And students typically give different reasons why they might have done this. Usually there's no like good reason. There's no reason that's considered acceptable. There's no excuse that's okay, that's okay then. The idea is that as university students, you are supposed to know what plagiarism is, and you are supposed to complete work honestly. And when you submit a piece of work, you declare that it is your own work with your own words, unless you're quoting someone else, and your own ideas unless you're referencing someone else. But often I find the underlying cause of problems with students who do plagiarize is related to like poor writing practices, and sometimes that can be poor time management. Sometimes it can be insufficient reading and therefore insufficient understanding. And then sometimes it's about relying too heavily on copying and pasting, like when taking notes and preparing. But that's something that we're going to look at next week when we look at synthesizing. I do have some sympathy, though, with the idea that plagiarism is quite a Western idea, or our notion of plagiarism is a Western idea. which is based on the writer as some kind of artist and ideas and expressions as property, and that it is disrespectful to copy without acknowledgement. If you remember my example at the beginning, the Chinese girl who had basically, who had memorized the text and then copied it, did not think it was disrespectful to do so. She thought she was doing something good. In Western education, we tend to emphasize the analytical and the evaluative. We encourage students to criticize and recombine sources of knowledge through synthesis. In UK education, it's okay and it's even good to question traditional wisdom. But in many Asian cultures, for example, there might be a preference for conserving and reproducing existing knowledge and showing reverence to it, showing respect for it. So not changing it and not questioning it. That's an argument put forward by a guy called Ken Highland from about 15 years ago. I think he might be overgeneralizing Asian cultures, though. So I'm not sure if it's really fair to say we do this in the West and they do this in the East, and so therefore, if you're not from the West, you need to learn about the West in order to understand plagiarism. But that is one of the things that I've been trying to do in this lecture. And perhaps the key issue, for me at least, from what I've been saying today, is that the conventions of academic writing value being productive, and they don't value copying. They don't value parody. They value productive. They value you trying to be the author of your own words and of your own arguments and answers to questions, like the person who makes the pie from their own ingredients. Okay. A few words quickly about plagiarism at the University of Hertfordshire. This is the definition of plagiarism that the university uses, very similar to what we've seen elsewhere. Presenting another person's work as your own without acknowledging the source fully. And added here is, to avoid plagiarism, you must always include referencing and citations for all the material you used in producing your assessment. And I'd like to suggest that this is not something that you can rely on doing after you've written an assignment. It has to be built into everything you do. They also point out that plagiarism can take numerous forms, and it can include copying from any sources, including something you've been given as a handout in a lecture. It includes like copying code. It includes copying formulas, graphics, images without citation. And of course, you're not allowed to copy your own work and submit it a second time. Now, if you're wondering how we recognize plagiarism, then I think a lot of students only really think about Turnitin, and I'll say a little something about Turnitin if you'd like me to. But I'd point out that sometimes students will tell teachers about other students, oh, this person has plagiarized. But much more often than that is that when we're reading a piece of work, when a lecturer is reading a piece of work, they can recognize quite easily when something has not been written by one of their students. There's something, we see like changes in style within an essay where something has been copied and pasted. It's amazing how many students manage to copy and paste into their essays and they don't change the font. So sometimes it's really easy to spot. But I will say something about Turnitin if you'd like me to. So I'll demonstrate something for you. I've taken this this document that I'll put it on StudyNet when I upload the recording of this lecture. So this is a really simple document produced by the creators of Turnitin, which is, they ask, what is Turnitin and how does Turnitin work? And just as an experiment, I thought, okay, I will write a version of this and I'll submit it to Turnitin to see what happens. So if I just copy and paste, you see there, like the first text says, Turnitin is the leading originality checking and plagiarism prevention service. If I just copy and paste that and submit it to Turnitin, you can guess what's going to happen. That Turnitin recognizes everything that I've submitted comes from somewhere else, and it will tell me where I've taken it from. Now, just to make a quick point, like I can copy and paste, and okay, that's really bad plagiarism, obviously. If I write according to iParadigms and then quotation marks and copy and paste, is that better or worse? And what about if I do this? Well, I'm going to use a direct quotation. Well, Merriam says it's slightly better. Yeah, I mean, I'll show you what Turnitin thinks about this in a moment. Can anyone spot the difference between paraphrase 1 and paraphrase 2? What I've done with paraphrase 2 is I've deliberately put some spelling mistakes into my quotation so that Turnitin won't recognize it. What do you think about my strategy? I hope you think it's a terrible idea. It is a terrible idea because if I'm quoting someone, I should get their words right. But I'm just showing you this to highlight what the limitations of Turnitin are. Because look, if I just copy and paste, I get 100% match. Turnitin gives me a similarity score. It's not a plagiarism score, it's a similarity score, and it gives me 100% similarity. If I include according to iParadigms, I get like a 97% match, but this is not plagiarism because I'm being honest about where the words are coming from, and I'm being honest about whose words are being used, okay? So it's not plagiarism to use a direct quotation. It's not good writing practice. I'm not going to get a good grade for my essay because I probably haven't done any work to produce this, but it's not plagiarism. Look what happens here though. If I add regular spelling mistakes, I get a 0% match. Okay, this is what Turnitin gives me, because how Turnitin works is that it's looking for a string of 27, 28, 29 characters, and it's looking for matches of strings of characters. So if you, obviously I'm telling you this for a reason, but if there's a spelling mistake after every 3 words, then Turnitin will not find any kind of match. But I hope you agree that paraphrase 2 is a much worse thing to do than paraphrase 1. So I go from a 100% score to a 97% score to a 0% score. But the second paraphrase is a much worse thing to do, and the Turnitin score is not an indicator by itself of quality. If I do something like this, Turnitin is an online service with 2 broad functions. It simplifies electronic submission of written work and the provision of subsequent feedback. This is an example of good writing, where what I've done here is I've read the document from Turnitin and then I've tried to organize it myself. I recognize from the text, oh, it does 2 things. It does A and it does B. And as long as I'm owning the paragraphs myself and trying to write it from my own sensible organization, I do not need the words from the original text. So this is not an example of me paraphrasing. I'm not just trying to be tricky with changing occasional adjectives and making things passive. I'm imposing my own organization over the text. We'll come back to that in future weeks, but that's how you end up with a 0% in score and 0 and good writing. Okay, so I want to end by just suggesting some reasons to be cheerful. Although more and more people are talking about plagiarism and studying it, we've got better technology for recognizing technology, and we've got universities getting more serious about how they treat plagiarism cases, with this also being an international issue. When a student plagiarizes, they're unlikely to find that people are sympathetic towards them. But we are generally in UK universities trying to use things like Turnitin to help you learn about what plagiarism is. I hope we're trying to train you to reference properly. We use things like Turnitin for education rather than punishment. And we try to be consistent within and between universities. Hopefully, a better global understanding of the importance of local influence on plagiarism will help too. And of course, if you show good academic integrity, it will aid the reputation of the course that you're on. So if there's plagiarism problems with a particular university, it damages the university. So all students should have an interest in writing well. So if you're here, if you're still watching this, I think you're intelligent enough not to cheat. I think use of sources, just like when you use good ingredients to make a pie, it's an opportunity to demonstrate how good you are at cooking. Using your reading and your writing is an opportunity to demonstrate your learning and how intelligent you are. And I would recommend that you all embrace opportunities to learn and show off what you learn. Now that's all. Oh, the last thing that I will tell you about very briefly is I showed you this article earlier about students cheating in exams. As part of that, part of the story, the journalist who wrote the story approached a website that said that they could write plagiarism-free essays for money, and the journalist paid £143 for a 1,500-word essay with no obvious plagiarism. It's the worst kind of plagiarism, of course, if you pay someone to write your essay for you. But when the journalist gave this essay to a lecturer to evaluate, the feedback was really, really poor. So the worst thing that any student could possibly do at university is to buy an essay. It's the worst thing you could do ethically, but it's also the worst thing you can do with your money, because no one can write good essays for you. If anyone has any questions, concerns, or feedback, you're very welcome to email me. You're very welcome to ask now. And I have about 5 minutes before I need to move on. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, please do ask. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you. I want to ask, what percentage are we looking at for plagiarism?
Well, plagiarism can be 2%, right? Plagiarism isn't a number. Now, unfortunately, I know that some schools at the University of Hertfordshire do use a number as part of their policy. And I've spoken to I've been working at the University of Hertfordshire for 18 months. And it's not, it's the same as most universities, that there'll be diversity within the university community. Some lecturers will know a lot more about how Turnitin works than others. Some will use a number just to be just to give a clear message to students, and I kind of sympathise with that, because sometimes students just want a clear message. But so I know in some schools they'll use the number 20%. Now, what they really mean though is not that if your Turnitin score is 20%, then you've plagiarized. If it's 19%, you haven't plagiarized. If it's 21, you have. Nobody is saying that. But I think what some schools say is that when someone has a Turnitin score of 20% similarity or higher, they will then take a close look at the essay in a way that they might not otherwise. But that's just one way I think some people can deal with, like, receiving hundreds of essays from one group of students. The fact is that the definition of plagiarism we've got is using somebody else's words or ideas without acknowledging them.
Okay.
So actually, you could have, right? I had, I'll give you an example of my own. I once had a student who gave me a piece of work, which, it wasn't it wasn't bad. Yeah, some parts of it were quite good. It was very clear that the student had written it himself, and it was quite honest. I could recognize, like, his writing style. He's trying to reference, so actually for the majority of the essay, there's very little similarity. A couple of direct quotations, that's not plagiarism, all fine. And suddenly I get to the final paragraph and Turnitin shows me this whole paragraph comes from somewhere else. And I could recognize it myself as I'm reading it. Like, suddenly the style of the final paragraph is completely different to the rest of the essay. And basically, when I spoke to the student about it, he told me he didn't really know how to finish his essay. He didn't feel confident about writing conclusions. So he just took a paragraph from a book somewhere and just copied and pasted that. Okay. And obviously he didn't reference it. I think he was in a rush. It was close to the deadline. He wanted to finish it. It obviously wasn't a very smart thing for him to do. I don't think it was an accident, because obviously he chose to do it. But his overall Turnitin score was quite low. But I think that was quite a bad case of plagiarism, because your conclusion is an important part of your essay. So to take a whole paragraph and just to dump it in the end of the essay, I think that's kind of bad cheating, especially if he expected me not to notice. And on the other hand, I've seen students where they've submitted it, the Turnitin report is like 40%. When I look at their work, they're just constantly using direct quotations, and that constitutes, like, they haven't actually plagiarized at all. They're showing where the words and ideas come from. But my feedback to those students is, well, you've identified some interesting points from your reading, but this isn't entirely your work, is it? Because you're relying too much on other people's words. And I'm lucky that I have a 9-year-old daughter, so my daughter knows how to copy and paste from a document. And I'll point out to students, look, my daughter could do this. She doesn't understand the topic the way that you understand it, but she could still get that, copy and paste it, put quotation marks, put the writer's name, use a reporting verb. It's not really good writing. So I know that's a long answer to your question, but I think it's important to say plagiarism isn't a number. A high Turnitin score might not be plagiarism, and a low Turnitin score might be plagiarism. And sometimes the most suspicious thing I ever see is when a Turnitin similarity report says 0%. That's very worrying. If someone has 0%, it means there's like, they probably haven't included a title page because the other students should have similar title pages. They might not have included a reference list, or I've seen in the past students with a reference list that has no matches in it. So either they've got the formatting all wrong, or they've just invented the references. So a 0% score is not great news either.
Okay, thank you. What I was trying to understand on the plagiarism is when it gets to a percentage, you click on it and it shows you where each source are from. When you look at those sources where they are from, what percentage are you looking at those sources? Is there anything in particular?
No, nothing. No, I would say like don't. I'm trying to see if I've got an example here. So you mean if I'm looking at something like this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just tell you either that one is like 7%, the one on yellow, or the other one is 3%. I want to understand that better.
No, I don't, like, just my advice is like, just don't think about the numbers. If you will know, if you write an essay and you mostly are just referring to one article and you're often using exactly the same words as that article, then that won't be a good piece of writing, right?
Yeah.
And you don't need a number to tell you that. Right? Now, in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to do a session on synthesizing, and I think there's an approach to synthesizing you can take, which really forces you to kind of just write in your own words because you're organizing the information yourself.
So when you're writing your word, you have to cite it. What are you looking at? That's my concern too. Citing in your own words.
Well, yeah. Well, obviously you've learned the words from somewhere, and you've got the terminology from your reading. So that's why I'm, in this lecture when I talked about the postmodern, like the postmodern idea is like our words are not really our own. All of our words have come from somewhere. So yeah. Put that to one side. When I say your own words, I mean you're not relying on, say, like more than 4 words in a row from somewhere else. Just as roughly, I mean, because if you're writing an essay about like global communication, you're not going to change the words global communication. I've seen students write essays on environmental damage, for example, and they kept trying to change the word environmental and change the word damage, and they didn't need to because it was the key term from their field. But it's when you are, if you find yourself taking like not just the noun but the verb from someone else's sentence, then is that their sentence or is it yours? Like. When maybe I should talk not just about like using your own words, but use your own sentences. Use your own paragraphs.
Okay. But another thing is that is when you write it in your own word, you reference it still picks it up. Turnitin still picks it up after you've referenced it.
Yeah, no, but like, something we really need to establish, and Silveria has asked a question in the chat, what happens to someone who has 0% of plagiarism in Turnitin or 47%? I can't make this is a really, really important point. I know some lecturers will say this, but it's not really. Turnitin does not detect plagiarism. Turnitin cannot detect plagiarism. Okay, only a human can detect plagiarism. Turnitin detects similarity. And similarity and plagiarism are not the same thing. As you're saying, like if you reference a source, then and you're using if if the source is, what have we got here? Ballantyne and Roberts. Okay, you're using two authors' names, Ballantyne and Roberts. That's 3 words. You might do that 3 or 4 times in your essay, and probably someone else has referenced that as well. Ballantyne and Roberts, 2012. Yeah, there's a good chance that will get picked up by Turnitin because it's the same sequence of letters that they can find somewhere else. But that's not plagiarism, that's a reference. Yeah. So this,
Okay.
what I'd like you to, something I'd like you to take away from this session is there's no relationship between the number between that number and plagiarism. If you are not presenting someone else's words or ideas as if they are yours, then you're not plagiarizing.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to bother you.
No problem.
Okay, so like that's where you see student work so percent, and you see publication 2%. So that's what it means in Turnitin.
Yeah. I mean, it means like if you've written 2,000 words, then what? My math isn't good enough. What 40 of them? 20 of them are from one source, and 20 of them are from another source. Now, it all depends on what those words are and how they appear in that source. If the example you can see on the screen right now, if the match is an end of text reference, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It just means that someone else has referenced the same source in exactly the same way. So it's probably a good sign. Yeah? But if you've got 2 sentences in the middle of a paragraph, 2 whole sentences, and they're exactly the same as a source, and you haven't referenced them, you've made no attempt to put them in your own words, then that's plagiarism. And that might be fewer words. Mary has asked a question about, in a case of group work, if multiple students collaborated on writing an essay and each one wrote a paragraph, but one of the students claims to have written 2 paragraphs and credited themselves for someone else's in the group, the professor would only see the essay and the collaborators. What can be done in this situation? Is it plagiarism? It's a really interesting question, Miriam, but I guess, Miriam, are you asking about, in this situation, is it a group task?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay, so if I'm a lecturer and I give my students an assignment where they have to work together and produce a piece of writing together, then I have to be aware. I mean, I've done that in the past and I'll do it again in the future. I have to be aware that group work is not easy, and it's most likely that one person will do more work than one of the others. So what we'll often do with an assignment like that is we might have one task which the group complete together, and we might not have another task that everyone does individually, which might be like a reflection on the group task. That's the way if I was setting that assignment, I would add some reflective writing. And then I don't need to worry too much about, I know it's a fact that there won't be a perfect balance of work within the group. And sometimes that's fine. We just have to live with that. That's life. And any lecturer who sets a group task has to decide in advance, does all the group get the same grade, or will they get individual grades? And that's a difficult decision for us to make, but as long as there's a good reason, there are advantages and disadvantages, but as long as we give the clear reasons before we set the task, I think we're okay. A student who says, I wrote this paragraph, when actually another student wrote the paragraph, then yeah, that is plagiarism. Yeah, absolutely, because it's saying I did this work when I didn't really do the work. I think in your scenario, Miriam, it would be very difficult for the lecturer to see the truth, if you like. there is a way that we could do it. But if I set you an assignment and you and 3 other students had to write 1,000 words, and you told me you'd actually written 500 of them, then how do I know? I could ask the other students. They might give me different answers. There are things I could do. I could ask you to write. I could set you a little test. I could give you a time limit. I could get other samples of your work, and I could compare. There's a branch in criminology. There's a branch of like forensic linguistics where we can analyze someone's writing and say whether this person wrote that letter to this person or not. So there are ways that we can analyze language to try to work out who is the most likely writer. But I think whenever you get a group task, the person who set the task already knows that it's not possible always to tell exactly how much work each person has done. But your example is an example of plagiarism, but I don't know how it could be punished because it would be very difficult to prove that plagiarism.
Yeah, exactly. This situation happened to me, by the way.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to prove it unless like you go into the technicality, like maybe go into the Office 365 and searching for logs, or maybe if it was on GitHub, it would give you a log of the times when this document was
yeah.
But I didn't do it through that, so it would be difficult to prove it.
Yeah, but probably it's quite possible that what the lecturer wanted your learning outcomes to be, it might not be relevant to that in a way. They might have just set you a task where they want you to work together and they want you to produce something. And if someone does more work than someone else, then so be it. It's really unfortunate if a student, tells a lie and claims to have done something they haven't done. That's unfair, but it might not. There are ways that we can mark things like that where it kind of doesn't matter in a way, but if where there's a group task, there's always going to be an element of it becomes even less clear who is the author of every part of it, right? Silveria asked a question about what happens to someone, like according to the amount of plagiarism. And I think what Silveria is probably asking is like, how bad is the punishment, maybe? So actually, the seriousness of a kind of an academic offence is typically judged on like how many times a student has committed that offence and at what stage of their university career. So basically, if you plagiarize really badly in your final year on something that's worth a lot of credits, that's typically considered a worse thing to do than plagiarizing in your first ever assignment in your first year. And it's also, if there's a student who is found guilty of plagiarizing in semester A and then they do it again in semester B, they should expect a worse punishment in semester B than in semester A. Because in most cases, we will look for, the first time a student plagiarizes, I think most people will treat it as, here's an opportunity for this student to learn. They're already going to get a bad grade for that mark, so here's an opportunity for them to learn about how to do it better next time. Most people I speak to at Hertfordshire are actually really sympathetic in that way, and like the first time someone plagiarizes, we might assume they need to learn what academic integrity is. But if they do it again, then it means it's not about learning academic integrity, it's something else. Okay, I better go because I need to go and pick up my daughter from school. So thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you so much.
I know it's something that you guys will worry about, but actually, if you follow the right kind of procedures for reading to write, it should never be a problem. and you can always use like Centre for Academic English Services, like the drop-it-ins in the LRCs. If you're really worried about something, you can always take it to one of my colleagues and say, oh, could you look at this paragraph? You know, does that feel like it's my words and not theirs? Because I appreciate that, you know, don't do that with every assignment you ever write. But as you're learning like the difference between what is good writing and what is not good writing, then please do use us. Okay. So have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Take
Take care.
care.
Bye.